Break. We are moving into the second supply chain management session for today. It is stage 2, the appropriate ingredient GMPs under FSMA. This session is sponsored by Sabinsa. Thank you so much. It is moderated by Shaheen Majeed. And I just jokingly told Shaheen that I was going to introduce him as Shaheen the Man. I don't think he took me seriously, but this is Shaheen the Man. Shaheen is the marketing director for Sabinsa. He basically knows Sabinsa from the ground up. He has worked at his father's company since he was 17 years old. He pretty much knows the company inside out. He has been in positions such as the customer service, sales positions. He's represented the company's substantial portfolio of proprietary nutritional and cosmeceutical ingredients. I mean, pretty much across the board. So Shaheen knows Sabinsa. Shaheen, now I'd like to bring you up so you can introduce our two presenters for the day. Thank you. Told you
I saw you do that. Lachasa, thank you very much. All right, let's get this party started. We've been learning so much today, and we're going to continue that here with stage 2 of supply chain management. And our specific topic is going to be on appropriate ingredient GMPs under FSMA, Food Standardization and Modernization Act, Food Safety Modernization Act. Now, Sabinsa is a supplier for ingredients. We've been doing this for 30 years. We also cultivate and harvest many of the products that we bring to the marketplace. But as I stand up here and we look at FSMA, this is going to impact everybody, whether you're a supplier, whether you're a contract manufacturer, whether you're a marketing company. And so, it's very important to pay attention to some of the finer details of the presentations that are going to be seen in the next few minutes. So we're going to look at these two presentations, and we're going to focus on two major areas: the Foreign Supplier Verification Program and Preventive Controls. Now, the overall idea is really about transparency in the supply chain area. So the first presentation is going to be by Gary Swanson. He's the Senior Vice President of Global Quality at Herbalife. He has almost 40 years of experience in nutritional and pharmaceutical quality and operations. With that kind of experience, what we're going to expect here is a structural outline of FSMA and some of the key details. So with that, Gary, come on over.
Thank you, Shaheen. First of all, I'd like to thank Michael McGuffin, the APA team, Natasha Weaver for helping set this up. It's probably been one of the most professional and well-received sessions that I've attended in the last couple of years. So my hat's off to the group for putting this together. Before I get started, I do want to say that as I picked out of the hat the FSMA topic today, I was just very relieved I didn't pick NDI. So so with that, we're going to start into the FSMA program. But for FSMA, really what we want to do is ask some basic questions at the beginning: how, what, where, and why. So first question is, why is FSMA here today anyway, since we've had regulations in place for, 50 years, 75 years? So the question really comes down to, why is this law now needed? When you look at it, every year, about 48 million people get sick, 128,000 get hospitalized, and 3,000 die each year from foodborne illnesses. And that's all according to the CDC. Okay, look at the timeline over the last, since 2006, so the last 10 years, you can see that a number of major incidents have helped form the need for this law. And certainly the federal government and President Obama felt it was necessary to change the way that we handled food in this country. So we had the E. coli outbreak in spinach back in 2006. We had the deliberate contamination of wheat gluten, that everybody remembers. It's in 2007, and going into the peanut butter fiasco, which caused a lot of concern and had major consequences for the owners of that company, and which brought in now to the law 2011 signed by President Obama, and I think it was January 4th. So, what is FSMA? And really, if you try to encapsulate it into a statement, really, what is it all about? It really takes food companies, and rather than deal with issues and make sure that you have processes in place to deal with issues, it really turns it into a preventative system. And it's a cultural change, but it really does gives Congress a mandate for developing a risk-based inspection program. Okay, and does place the responsibility now on all people that run food companies here in the United States and internationally. Okay, how does that manifest itself, and what do we get out of that? One is trying to create a culture of companies thinking about food safety rather than thinking about just food production. And that's a huge mindset shift. Okay, creating areas of understanding and identifying areas of vulnerability, so looking at your process and trying to figure out where things could go wrong as opposed to where things did go wrong. Allowing the FDA to enforce compliance of procedures, processes, and practices that are supposed to help lower the risk of problems inside a plant. The FDA really didn't have that mandate or that capability before. And finally, promptly responding to identified problems, preventing them from getting to the point at which now they become a concern out in the field. Concern inside a plant before a product gets released is much easier to handle than a concern out in the field. Okay, I'm going to give you an idea of kind of what the 5 major elements of FSMA are. It's really all about. And the first thing is importation of foods. It does give the FDA a lot more control over the importation of foods, that is, ready-to-eat foods, being brought into the United States for consumption, for sale and consumption. It gives them the ability to mandate and require comprehensive-based controls to the food supply to prevent significantly or significantly minimize the likelihood of problems occurring. So again, that's the prevention part, and that for them, that's a critical component. When the FDA comes into audit in the future, they are going to specifically focus on the preventative controls that a company's put in place. Okay, they now have a much broader control and a much broader allowance for doing compliance audits and enforcing companies to look at their food manufacturing processes differently. Okay, response, again, this comes down to things like recall. It usually has always been voluntary. It gives them a mandate to actually allows them to force a recall if necessary. Probably not much different than what's out there now, but this does write into law that they can mandate recalls when they feel it's necessary. They don't think they'll use it that much, but it is there. And finally, within all of the government structures, FDA, USDA, Border Patrols, they all now will develop much stronger relationships with each other to manage food safety. Okay, so FSMA is really broken down to a whole bunch of different laws. For the folks in this room, the 2 that probably are the most important, the ones that you would end up following and adhering to, obviously is 21 CFR Part 117 and 21 CFR Part 1. I don't know how those numbers got around that way, but they did. So 117 is really what we're going to focus on today. One is the Foreign Supplier Verification Program, as you'll see in a few slides more. That's really coming down the pipeline. Okay. In this slide, should have really been titled Size Matters. It's businesses with 500 employees or more are now, as of September 16th of this year, are mandated to have a FSMA program in place. That includes companies like Herbalife and any other company that's got 500 employees within the company structure. I suspect that's within the United States. It's by 2017, September 18th, less than 500 employees, then you'll be mandated to have FSMA program in place. So the number of companies here, I expect that there's a number of companies that are fitting into that category that are here today. What is surprising me a little bit is that the folks I do talk to that are on that platform of smaller than 500 are still trying to understand FSMA. They're still trying to understand the concept of FSMA, what the Food Safety Modernization Act really means to them, and how they fit into it. And so there's still a lot of learning that's going on. And just to give you a perspective, we started this process 2 years ago, so that we'd be ready for September of this year. We really started the implementation and everything else in January of this year. So we were prepared by January to actually start the implementation process. So folks, that are dealing with 500 employees less, you've got 12 months to go. Hopefully, you've started to put some plans together and put your budgets together to allow you to implement this, because there's not only time involved, there's a bit of cost involved. And you want to be starting to think about that now if you haven't yet. It's for much smaller facilities, they're into 2018, and there's all kinds of definitions around that. And the milk ordinance, I can't explain that. I'm not into the dairy system, but they've got 2018. So you've got, so that kind of gives you an idea of the timelines that we're working up against. Okay, for the foreign supplier verification, you can see all the timelines there. 2017, 2018, 2019. So there is, and again, we won't focus on that because that's really a whole lunchtime discussion on its own. Okay, so within 21 CFR Part 117, we really have, I counted them, 7 different parts to it, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. We're going to focus on B, C, and F today. The others, general provisions or supply chain program, again, that's supply chain program. There's a lot of stuff in there, but that's really a topic onto itself. Modified requirements and withdrawal really doesn't apply to most people in this room. Okay, now under CGM, so Part B, Subpart B, CGMPs, this is kind of written around to try to give you an idea of some of the issues that are within the CGMPs. And when you look at recalls, about 1/3 of all recalls are the result of poor training and education of employees, and that's a real focus of FSMA program is training, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more. So it kind of states that management's got to ensure that the employees who manufacture, process, or hold food are qualified, and they're going to be very specific about what qualifications mean. To be able to take on those duties. 21 CFR Part 111, Dietary Supplements, also did that for, they had qualified individuals. So FSMA's taken a page out of that book in order to deal with qualified individuals, to deal with food safety programs. And they're going to have a lot of responsibility, and they're going to be noticed during an audit. In dietary supplements, this is, I think this is where a lot of the confusion is going to occur until people get settled down, because it seems like in 21 CFR Part 111, there's still a lot of confusion about what to do there. So when it comes to 21 CFR Part 117, if you're a dietary supplement manufacturer and you're also a food manufacturer, you really have to comply with both regulations. If you're strictly a 111 manufacturer, you're really predominantly going to follow the 111 regulations. There might be some cases or some pieces of 117 that might come into play, whether it be dealing with raw materials and whatnot, but there is a bit of a line of segregation between the two regulations. I think that'll get more borne out over the next couple of years as to how that looks. And it is important to say, if there is a conflict between the two regulations for dietary supplement manufacturers, that 111 does dominate. Okay, so for subpart C, which is HARP C, another term that you're going to have to learn if you haven't already, which is hazard analysis and risk-based. So just assume risk-based is one word. Preventive controls, and we're going to go into that. There's a whole program inside that, and a lot of the rest of this presentation will deal with that. You can see there's some exemptions in there that, again. We put dietary supplements in there, but when you look at seafood and you look at juice and you look at alcoholic beverages and you look at low acid canned foods and you look at just a simple warehouse that's storing foods that doesn't require any special temperature requirements, such as refrigeration, they are exempt from that. There is qualifiers though, because there's a whole section that says, in the event that something goes wrong, then the FDA can come back and apply 117 to them. So, and ingredient manufacturers clearly are not exempt from this law. So it's, as long as everybody understands that if you're a dietary ingredient supplier, manufacturer and supplier, you are subject to the rules and the regulations of 117. Okay, so if you looked at pre-FSMA and post-FSMA, very simply, pre-FSMA was 110, a beautiful little handbook that nobody ever opened. It's now replaced by 117, of course, with the provisions, and these are just kind of highlights that the allergen's a big piece of that, the cross-contract, not cross-contamination. Cross-contamination implies that something's already happened. Cross-contact, make sure it doesn't contact. So they're trying to add the phrases in there for preventative. The non-binding provision, that's really important, for education and training, now are binding, okay? So make sure that you understand what that means and what that means for your company. You're really going to be either training or hiring a specific individual for that. You can also use outside firms to help you there, but depending on the size of the company, a qualified individual will be required. Well, you'll be required. It's a question whether you hire, train, and have somebody in place, or whether you bring in an outside consultant. Okay, used to be HACCP, now it's HARP-C. Okay, and we've gone through that. We'll spend some time on that. Again, focusing on allergen, sanitation, and supply chain. Okay, and does require a preventative control qualified individual. Okay, it's records. Again, most companies probably already adhere to most of this, but this is really telling people now you have to have records for manufacturing foods and releasing foods, and then you got to store the records. You got to do all that stuff that most companies already do. But for the smaller food companies that don't do that, but again, this morning when I listened to the presentation where there's I don't know, there's 40 or 50 warning letters for people who didn't have master batch records and dietary supplements. Obviously, not everybody's getting the whole thing about records. So records now become part of the process, and you got to keep the records, and the FDA can take copies of the records whenever they want. Okay, that's mandated into law. And also really important is that the PCQI, which is that qualified individual, he or she is responsible for signing off on all those kinds of records. Okay, getting into a little bit about how Herbalife has kind of set this up. And since we started in somewhere around late December, early January, and we had September 16th as our deadline, this gives you a little bit, try and give you a little bit of a view into our world of what we did and give you some examples of how we did it. Okay, so for, again, the complete PCQI, we've hired an individual. It's whether, and they could have been, it's a member of our team already, but they're going through a full qualification. They've already gone through the full qualification. Now they're our PCQI, and they've signed off on the food safety plan. They sign off on other documents that are required for the FSMA program. You can see. He or she's responsible for the preparation of the food safety plan, the validation of the preventive controls, review of records, and the reanalysis of the food plan, which is supposed to be done minimum every 3 years. So then we get into the part about, how do you know what to do for FSMA? And we actually brought in an outside firm. In this case, it was UL. And we spent 6 months going through a gap assessment and then actually setting up the gap closures. So with that gap assessment, we looked at facilities and equipment and food safety plan and material system, production system, manufacturing controls, warehouse and distribution. So all those things that you'd want to look at in even a general audit and see where we were in relationship to complying with FSMA regulations. The things that we saw that were the most biggest gaps, if you will, came down to allergens, came down to on-the-job training, and environmental pathogen testing. So kind of looking at like that, probably every company would hit those 3 buttons and maybe a few more. Okay, so again, those were the gaps that we had and the corrective actions that we had. Okay, so we get then into the writing and implementation of the food safety plan. The food safety plan really has to be facility specific. So you can't do one at corporate and then just apply it to 4 or 5 facilities. Every site has to really should be doing their own food safety plan, because no 2 facilities are alike. Whether it be equipment, whether it be personnel, whether it be laboratories or anything else that you're doing, there's some differences between one and another. So we have 2 manufacturing sites in the US, so we wrote a food safety plan, had a food safety team. As you can see in the very front end, we actually established food safety teams. So each facility has its own team. So it's, so again, the food safety plan has to be prepared and authorized and approved by the PCQI. Okay, now you can see what we went through, the hazard analysis. This is all part of the food safety plan. Hazard analysis, preventive controls, monitoring preventive controls, corrective actions, verification, validation, supply chain, recall, and reanalysis. So it's, and I'll, again, quickly, how are we doing? Oh, I better go real quickly. This gives you an idea looking at hazard analysis, and this is this template here that we use. There's actually a website at the end of this presentation that actually tells you, you can actually go onto their website and you can pull the template off. Honestly, folks, that's what we did. Okay, we weren't going to try to create our own templates if there was one available, and that's totally acceptable by the FDA, because this alliance group that put it together, they're authorized by the FDA. So I know it's probably difficult to read the details of that, but that's to give you an idea. We went through a hazard analysis, and what was important inside our plant And we went through every piece of it. So you're really looking at biological, which is microbiological, you're looking at chemical, and you're looking at physical. Okay, and those are the three main areas that you're talking about. Okay, so you can see it's, it's determine if the hazard requires preventive control, justify the decision, and identify the controls for significant hazards, and so on and so forth. So it does start to follow. The important thing is, what I want to really emphasize is there's beginning, a middle, and an end to all this, and we're kind of in the middle now. The beginning was, okay, how are we going to set this up? Who are we going to get involved? Identifying teams. Now we're in the middle, we're identifying everything, so we can get to the end of the program, we got our food safety plan in place. Okay, here's, we also had a flow chart. So for every process, a flow chart's required. And everybody's done them for HACCP. Okay, so similar there, but now again, it's looking for the preventative controls. Okay, then you go into the preventive controls. You see process controls. We, for example, do liquid aloe. So we have heat process controls. We have lots of different things. We have the amount of preservative and everything else, and we have a very clear microbiological program around that. So that sort of thing, and keep in mind, we do an acidified food, and it's dictated or controlled by 21 CFR Part 114, but 21 CFR Part 117 still applies to those that particular food. Okay, so then you get into again the allergens, the sanitation, supply chain. So then we get into the monitoring, preventative actions, and again you can see that that we got template for that, and we created a template to monitor the preventive controls and how do you monitor. So again, that's all in place, and if you want to see it, I think it'll be available to review, if you ask for a copy. Then we get into corrective actions. They don't call them CAPAs anymore. Now they shorten it up because I guess they didn't want to use up all the letters. So they're now CAPs. And that's corrective action procedures. And with that, when you do a gap analysis or you do any kind of a problem, you've got to go into a CAP program. So that's part of FSMA. That's mandated now versus something that you think about doing or do on your own. Let's see. For the verification procedures, again, here we have a template for that, and there's a whole verification procedure, and this happened to be with aloe again, verifying that everything is exactly the way it's supposed to be. Okay, this one here is going to probably be a bit of a problem for everybody. It's validation. Okay, again, everybody's pretty good at setting a procedure up, writing a process, writing a control around that, writing a specification, everything. But validating is a little bit more difficult, and it requires a little bit more imagination. But again, the Food and Drug Administration is going to come in and verify that you validated your preventive control process. Does it work exactly according to plan? If you have a temperature setting, is it working? Is anything failing along the way? Because that's what they're looking for. They're looking for, if you had a failure, exactly what did you do? Come back and fix it. Okay, supply chain program, we're not really going to go into that today too much, but again, this is for raw materials, and that's for a whole other discussion on bringing raw materials into your facility. However, allergens are a big, big part of that, and making sure that you've got controls inside your warehouse. Okay, the recall plan, again, most companies do or should have a recall plan, but this is something that, have you got a control process in place? Do you do mock recall? You do all the things that said if that recall plan had to be put into action would actually work. And so they've mandated the recall plan for foods. Okay, and then simply the reanalysis. Again, if you've got a template, here's reanalysis. Minimum every 3 years, you got to review your whole process, make sure that everything's current. Remember, if you do a change, you've got to go in and make changes to your food safety plan. So that's kind of a given, but every 3 years you got to review it to see that you haven't made changes. Okay, so it's for implementation. We're really talking. This is for contract manufacturers. If you have contract manufacturers, you got to stay close to them because they're going to have certain dates that they have to meet requirements, and you're going to have to follow their You're going to have to make sure that, as a company, if you're using them, you got to make sure that they're meeting their requirements. Foreign supplier, not straightforward, but in one slide or less. I've talked about, the purpose of it is to ensure that foreign suppliers are following the FSMA program, and they've got them in place. We have a site offshore, and we're working with them now to make sure that they're going to be FSMA compliant. Food safety, the foreign supplier verification, it does require that they share the responsibility of ensuring the safety of imported food. Okay, so on and so forth. And here, again, here's the websites for all that information around FSMA. The Food Safety Preventive Controls Alliance is a good website to go on to because that gives you all the templates and gives you a lot more information. And that's my story for today.
Gary, thank you for that. So next we have Ashish Talati. He leads a legal firm that has great FDA practice and is one of the industry's foremost experts on FDA regulatory matters. He is considered a leading authority in the areas of generally recognized as safe grass items and their requirements, and as well as new dietary ingredients. He also advocates on behalf of his clients before the FDA, FTC, Customs, DEA, USDA, and other federal agencies. So without further ado, Ashish, please. I think it's this one right here, right? That's right. I think it's over. This is the one, right?
Thank you. How's everyone doing? Looks like it's 4 o'clock almost. So, FSMA, obviously, there's a lot of activity that's going on, but unfortunately, in the dietary supplement space, I'm not seeing that much. So some of the acronyms, PCQI, how many have, just show of hands, how many have a qualified individual in their facility? Oh, wow, quite a bit. Okay, maybe I take that back. Okay, we are doing that. That's great. Because I think that, that is, we're all focused on NDIs and other issues in the dietary supplement space, but FSMA is something that's actually way broader and tremendously very, it's going to impact everyone. Okay. So I'm going to make it simple. I mean, Gary, you did a great job. I think his slide, you should all keep it, save it, and use it and refer it as much as you can because he has compiled a tremendous amount of knowledge in those slides. Something that would take weeks to understand. So great job. And Herbalife obviously has done a great job. They are way ahead of the curve. So something, it's great for us to learn. 3 questions. If you are in this business, 3 questions you will be asked. Be ready, be prepared to answer those. Those are the 3 questions. Are your plants compliant with the relevant provisions of the Food Safety Modernization Act? Do your plants have a FSMA food safety plan in place? And what is the status of your food safety FSMA supply chain program? So those are the questions that will be asked. Anything, if you do an M&A due diligence list, those are the questions there. If you have a customer, they will ask you those questions. I'm going to just summarize real fast. Obviously, we have 111 for finished products manufacturers. And basically, what FSMA does is kind of bridges that gap. Until now, companies were relying on 110. Now we have 117, and a lot of those, for suppliers, that's where they have to comply. So importers, a lot of the products, ingredients come into the U.S. are imported. They will certainly, get affected with the Foreign Supplier Verification Program. And again, that is also something very, very important. I think FDA is going to release a guidance. They're working on it. But once that guidance is released, a lot of information will get clear. So my presentation, I want to take a few examples. We have an example of a recall here where a company in a dietary supplement space, there was elevated levels of lead. This would be considered, if you expect that your material will have those kind of contamination, then this would be considered as a chemical hazard. Okay, so then what do you do? That's where I'm going to run through some of these recalls and then explain how FSMA is supposed to prevent all of this. There was another recall for an allergen. Here, there was a soy allergen, and certainly this was a recalled item. Again, this would be a chemical hazard. So when you prepare your hazard analysis, as you know, there are chemical, physical, biological hazards. This would fall under a chemical hazard. Salmonella would fall under biological hazard. Again, you see there was a recall here. And I try to pull examples from the dietary supplement space, not necessarily just the food companies, but just to make an example that the recalls do happen, and the FSMA is, the goal of FSMA actually is to prevent all of this. One more chemical hazard will be active pharmaceutical ingredients, products coming from outside of the US. A lot of times they are contaminated. If that is, let's say you're sourcing it from China or other countries, and you know that in that ingredient has a possibility, then in your hazard analysis, this would fall under as a chemical hazard. Physical hazard related recall, this company had some metal fragments. Again, if you do your hazard analysis and preventive controls, this would be a physical hazard. So the idea is prevention. At the end of the day, all of those companies had recalled their product, but the goal is if they have a hazard analysis and preventive control, a food safety plan, that would have basically caught all of those issues. So the companies have to first, they start with hazard analysis and they identify a lot of those biological, chemical, and physical hazards. And then once you identify those, if there is a control that you can apply, then that's what you have to do. Okay, so some of the controls, you have process controls, food allergen controls, sanitation controls, supply chain controls. On the supply chain, FDA is still working on a guidance that they will release. And then you have recall plan and other types of controls. Some of the common biological process controls, not going to get into these details, but lethal treatments, time temperature, formulation, dehydration, drying, chemical process controls, recipe management, storage, physical sorting, and then physical would be metal detection or glass. Okay, so we have sanitation control basically to have and avoid prevention of allergen cross contacts and cleaning of your equipment. So these are some of the ways you can have a food allergen controls, which I think is the most, or I would say the number one in my opinion. There's a lot of allergen and related recalls. And so identifying and marking allergen containing ingredients, segregating and storing those materials, and receiving and warehousing. And so there's a whole list of controls that you can implement. Okay, one more on the supply chain is a supply chain program that, again, FDA is working on a guidance, and that will make it a little more, give it a little more clarity, but the supply chain program is actually very important. So what can you do? This is where a lot of the information is out there. If you are a company, I know a lot of you have started working on this, but education, I think education is the number one. We're all here, and this is where you get the education and then training, And so the IIT out of Chicago, they have a very good food safety program. I encourage all of you to utilize their website. And then technical assistance. FDA has a very good technical assistance where you can email, call, mail them for any of the questions that you may have. So on the training, I highly recommend the Food Safety Preventive Control Alliance. They have a very good program. A lot of the templates that you may need, you can easily download, and here's their link. But certainly that's a great website with lots of information. Again, the FDA's TAN, Technical Assistance Network, people are asking a lot of questions. I have myself utilized it. They respond pretty fast. Certainly, that's a great tool if you have any questions, if you run into any issues. It's not just for the industry. Anyone can ask questions, and they will respond. These are some of the stats. You can see they have responded to 2,753 questions, and all of the stats are on their website. So certainly, take a look. But that is additional resource that's very useful. Okay, so that's my presentation. We'd love to take questions if you have any.
Thank you, Ashish. So let me just summarize really quickly on a few of the points, and then I'll open it up to questions right away. Gary mentioned something really great right at the beginning. It's a culture of food safety versus food production. We also covered the major elements of FSMA. We saw some of the compliance dates for the various companies in terms of their size. And we heard about the importance of trained and qualified personnel to be available at your sites. And then the need for a written food safety plan and their various parts. So as I open the floor up to questions, I have one, which is directly for Ashish. Where does someone start, Ashish? I mean, now we have the details of this. We saw a couple of links and websites. But where does someone go to start?
That's a good question. Obviously some of the dates are staggered. So companies, for 500 or under 500 employees have about a year. And then if you're a very small business, you have a couple of years. But the best way to start is educating yourself. And obviously a lot of you are here. When you go back to your companies on Monday, definitely look at the IIT's website and educating yourself. But putting a food safety team, and like Gary mentioned, that's very important. A lot of the knowledge is out there. Hiring a consultant will definitely expedite things. But companies do need to start. If you have not started, I highly encourage, because at some point you will need to do it for sure.
Thank you, Ashish. All right, guys, step up to the microphone.
Don't worry, Gary. Hi, Andrew Shaw with Herbalife. Ashish, I wanted to follow up on a comment you made when you first started your presentation. It sounded to me like you were suggesting that the industry's response to the NDI guidance was disproportionate relative to its response to FSMA, as far as the investment of resources, investment of education, and so forth. Could you expand a little bit on that?
Absolutely, good question. I think, NDIs are important, but at the end of the day, FSMA has far-reaching implications. And I'm not saying you need to write comments or challenge or do any of that. It's just understanding it, because if you look at our experience with the 2007 GMP rule, right? Companies are still getting 483s, and according to FDA, the dietary supplement industry is taking a long time to mature. So we have that experience behind us. Now we can use it as far as FSMA's implementation is concerned, to make sure that we are ahead of the curve. So that will reflect, hopefully, in getting less 483s down the road. So that's where I meant to encourage companies to be ahead of the curve.
Sure, yeah. Sure. So I would agree with that. I think our attention is disproportionately taken by the NDI guidance instead of FSMA, which is a lot bigger animal.
That's right.
To deal with. So, thank you.
Just a quick follow-up, I guess, comment and question to both of you, Gary and to Ashish. Do you think then FSMA narrows that gap left by CGMPs between dietary supplements and dietary ingredients?
Well, I was kind of thinking about, how FSMA and then it's for foods kind of relates to dietary supplements in 21 CFR Part 111. The interesting thing is when you watch the evolution of 21 CFR Part 111, it's taken 7 years for people to really wrap their arms around this. I think the FSMA, took a little bit more pragmatic approach and tried to identify what to focus on and how to do it more so than the dietary supplements. I don't think people took dietary supplements regulations as seriously. FSMA is much more because it was written into law about the authority that the FDA has, which they didn't have before. I think for FSMA, for 21 CFR Part 117, I think it's clear and allows companies to put something in place to work this through. I think it's a better law than what 111 was.
Okay. Any other questions out there?
Yes, so if you were not manufacturing food for distribution outside of your own restaurants, let's say you have a local chain of restaurants and you have a commissary, do these laws apply to that industry as well, or is this just for food heading for third-party wholesale?
I think maybe you're in a better position to answer.
I think there's exemption for that, but I don't really have a clear answer to that.
Okay.
Well, it's certainly there's a lot of rules for the different types of foods that are being produced and sold. The FSMA is going to the best of my knowledge from what I've read, FSMA does apply to everything that is going to be sold for consumption. So, but there are some exemptions within there, and I don't think neither one of us have enough information exactly what kind of food that you're referring to. But packaged foods do fit under 117. There are certain types of foods that don't.
So we run 3 juice bars, and there's an exemption in juice HACCP. If you have a commissary operation that also sells from the commissary to the public, then you're treated as if you have a restaurant, so to speak. And you're exempted from juice HACCP. You can actually sell, for instance, you can sell raw juice, which you can't normally do. So the question is, because they're treating us as a restaurant as opposed to, we're exempt under food HACCP, juice HACCP, would we also be exempt under FSMA?
I mean, I think there's an exemption for it because you're not packaging it, right? You're not, are you bottling it and shipping to somewhere else? No, right?
It's actually in a bottle.
It is, but you're just
But
for that
selling
premise.
it direct to consumer.
Direct to consumer
Across
on your premise.
Across the counter, yeah.
Yeah. So
But it is being bottled and stored for a period of time, correct?
It would be 2 to 3 days maximum.
Yeah, it sounds like you had a nice gray area.
All right, guys. Well, let's give a round of applause to Gary and Ashish. Just a quick shout out to APA and all the sponsors. Thank you again.